Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader, and welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do. Be sure and visit my website, blackbeltleadership.com, for more tips, tools, insights, and resources, and to follow me on social media. This particular episode, I want to talk about the commonplace conundrum and being trapped in a prison of your own making. You know, if given the choice, most of us would choose what's familiar over what's not. Don't believe me? Ask a goldfish. You may say, John, ask a goldfish. Well, think about it. A goldfish prefers the comfort and safety of the aquarium to living in open water where they would be prey of other fish. Now, they're fed daily. Their water's filtered of contaminants, and they can swim to their heart's content. Goldfish get to spend their days in leisure, enjoying the decorations and exploring their world in the open without fear of being eaten by a predator. Sounds like a great life, but they can only explore their world in the open to the edge of the aquarium. And that's where the problem comes in. While the aquarium is safe and familiar, it's also confining. Now, the goldfish can see what's beyond the edges of the aquarium, but sadly, they can never go beyond the boundaries of the glass. For them, it's safe, but it's also a prison. Now, commonplace by definition is that which is ordinary and not unusual. Familiar, by definition, is that which is well known from long or close association. And even though it's confining, it's restrictive, and it's a prison of sorts, most of us, if given the choice, would choose the commonplace, the familiar, over what's not. That's the conundrum of the commonplace. Now, think about it this way. From the moment you and I wake up every single morning, you and I find ourselves in an aquarium of our own making. And sadly, that limits our impact, our influence, and our potential for success and significance in life. You and I, we are all creatures of habit. And if we're not careful, we find ourselves mindlessly doing the same things over and over again. And yet we wonder and often talk to ourselves and others why nothing is changing in our lives. Now, here's the truth, a universal law that you need to understand. When you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. Let me say that again. When you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. If you do the same thing the same way over and over again and again, guess what? You're only going to get more of the same. If nothing changes, then nothing changes. Now, while this might work well in the manufacturing world, where exact replication and duplication are essential to success, it doesn't work very well in our quest to learn, to grow, to mature, and to become a better version of ourselves. Well, we all want to know if we buy a television at Best Buy and we turn it on, it's going to work, and we need that process duplicated so every TV works the same way. It doesn't work the same in the personal growth world. Well, let me challenge you for a moment to think about your typical day. When you wake up in the morning, what does your morning routine look like? Now, while the answer is going to be different for you and me and everyone that's listening to this podcast, the odds are really good that you essentially do the very same things the very same way over and over again every day with little or no deviance or variation. And you likely do what you do through your morning routine with little or no conscious thought. Do you really put thought into combing your hair, brushing your teeth, getting dressed, applying makeup, whatever it is that you do to get yourself ready for the day? Do you really give it a lot of conscious thought, or do you just simply mindlessly go through the motions, doing the same thing the same way over and over again? Well, how about your morning commute, whether it's work or school, or you're going upstairs, downstairs, or across the house to your home office? What does that look like? chances are it's another mindless routine. Now, if you drive to work or drive to school, chances are you've driven by the same branch bank for years, not realizing it's changed brands multiple times, as living in the commonplace conundrum has made you oblivious to what's happening in the world around you. Now, numbers of studies have shown that we spend up to 95% of our days mindlessly living life by default. I often refer to this, as do others, as living life on autopilot. Now, let me say, routines can be valuable. They can be an incredible tool to help us be more successful in life. But when our entire life is relegated to a routine, here's what happens. We end up imprisoning ourselves in a world of mediocrity that's relegated only to the familiar, to the commonplace. That's not living up to your black belt potential. Now, psychology today defines habit formation as the process by which behaviors become automatic. Behavioral research firms like Real Life Management have found that people form habits often without intending to do so. They just keep doing the same thing the same way until it becomes repetition. And as the brain gets familiar with a routine, guess what happens? The brain seeks to automate that process so it can be replicated over and over without significant thought. Have you ever noticed anytime you're trying to learn something new, you can only take in so much new information before your brain and your body feels tired? I remember trying to learn new katas, the forms that we do in the martial arts. And anytime I would be introduced to a new kata, I would have to break it down into pieces to learn. Why? Because the brain can only process so much new information at one time, while at the same time, our brain is trying to manage all the autonomic processes that keep our amazing bodies operating and moving and really living life. So the brain wants to internalize processes, what I call habitual patterns of behavior, and the brain wants to turn them into automated responses so that it can preserve essential brain power for when it's needed most. When we really need to think and pay attention to what's going on, the brain needs to automate as much as possible. So when we do need to do that heavy thinking, the capacity to do so is there. Now, the basal ganglia, it's buried deep within our forebrain. It's a collection of neurons that not only controls our voluntary movements, but that basal ganglia also plays a critical role in how the brain forms, processes, and stores habits. What happens? As we do things over and over, the basal ganglia recognize this as a habitual pattern of behavior, and it moves and relegates these processes to our rote memory, which require little conscious thought to perform. So when you think about it that way, our brain is actually working to imprison us in an aquarium of our own making as it seeks to automate as much of our day as it can. And if we're not careful, we allow our brain to halt our progress forward, and we end up settling for less. Now, it's that simple but profound process of thinking and becoming that we need to be aware of. As you think, you become. And once you stop thinking, you stop becoming. Habits become commonplace routines, and those habits that build up in our lives and are stored in our brain, those habits happen with little, if any, conscious thought. I mean, think about it. Do you really give thought to how you're going to use a spoon, how you're going to open a door, how you're going to drive a car, or how you're going to walk, talk, sit, or stand? No, we do those things by default because they have come ingrained patterns of behavior in our lives. Those simple processes, those routines have become rote programs within our brain, and we simply carry them out mindlessly all throughout the day. But it goes even further. You got to remember, our brain craves the familiar, and what it craves, it rewards. So when you and I experience a feel-good outcome through a choice or an action that we've made, the brain secretes a cocktail of chemicals, including the feel-good chemical dopamine, that essentially tells our brain, hey, whatever you did, this was great. Let's do it again. And so what does the brain do? It tells us to repeat the process. We get another chemical reward, and our brain starts to hardwire this behavior into our psyche. Now, the brain then responds by prioritizing this process, creating a neural shortcut to this stored behavior. And this starts the process of habit formation and automation. And the brain goes even one step farther to keep the habits ingrained. Within the center of our brain, near our brainstem, sits the reticular activating system. Now, this network of neurons, it regulates and it reinforces our behavior, but it also filters out information that is shared with our conscious brain and also determines what will be shared and what won't. So once the brain forms a habit, and that's stored in the basal ganglia, this behavioral routine embedded in the reticular activating system is going to filter out any information that might disrupt or challenge or otherwise question an established routine, so habitual processes can continue to operate as programmed. It essentially imprisons us in an aquarium of our own making, reinforcing the status quo. And once we find ourselves imprisoned in our own goldfish bowl, we quickly learn the boundaries. We know how far we can go before we strike the glass. And then what do? We settle into a life of existing, but not really living. Now, maybe that's why roughly 95 to 99% of people in the world today live what I call mediocre, average, lackluster lives. They sit back and they wonder to themselves, asking themselves, why am I not experiencing a greater measure of success, satisfaction, and fulfillment in my life? But what they don't realize is they have erected invisible boundaries that prevent this from actually happening in and through their lives. Sadly, just like the aquarium, these individuals can see where they want to go. They can see who they want to become, but they've relegated their lives to the familiar, to the commonplace, and they've essentially allowed themselves to become stuck where they are as they are living life by default. So how do we overcome the commonplace conundrum? Well, let me share with you 3 steps to help you get started. First, you've got to acknowledge that you are in an aquarium of your own making. Until we come to grips with the fact that we're stuck where we are and as we are, here's what happens. We remain oblivious to the potential for greatness within us and the endless opportunities for expansion that are around us every single day of our lives. That means that you and I have got to have that man in the mirror, woman in the mirror moment that I talk about often with ourselves. And we've got to realize that we're just existing, but we're not living up to our full potential. To be able to challenge the commonplace conundrum, here's what's got to happen. You've got to acknowledge that it was your limited thinking, your limited beliefs, the things that you have embraced, believed, and lived out that have built the walls of your glass prison that has sequestered you from experiencing more real-life success in your life. You know, it's like the person who's overweight and it's constantly complaining about the backache, the sore joints, the lack of energy, the struggles to sleep well at night, but refuses to do anything about it. I say it often. It's easier to do what you've always done than to do what's required to bring out about a better, healthier outcome for yourself and those you love. But if you're overweight, nothing's going to change until something changes in your life. And until you acknowledge that the problem actually exists, you can't fix the problem. Until you recognize that habitual patterns of behavior are the causes of the consequences in life that you are experiencing right now, things you don't like, only then can you start the process of altering or replacing those habits altogether. You know, you can deny your house is on fire and watch it burn to the ground, or you could admit that it's burning and do something about it. So step one, you've got to acknowledge you're in the commonplace conundrum. Now, step two, successful people do daily what unsuccessful people do sometimes or not at all. You got to understand when you're in the commonplace conundrum, it's comfortable, but you're trapped. Successful people do daily what unsuccessful people do sometimes or not at all. Successful people realize, as Dr. John Maxwell so vividly describes it, that everything worthwhile in our lives is uphill. That means we've got to work to get to the top. When you think about commonplace, how do we see that? Commonplace isn't uphill. Commonplace is at best a level plain or a pasture, but it's often a downhill slope that ultimately leads to nowhere. Now, black belt leaders in life understand a black belt doesn't signify that you've arrived and you know it all. I've talked about this often in my podcast, and for those of you that have had an opportunity to hear me speak live, I share that story often. Black belt leaders in life understand that a black belt is only a recognition that you are now a committed student, that you are dedicated to a lifetime of learning, growing, improving, and striving daily to become better than you were the day before. Black belt leaders understand this only happens when you venture into the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable, and the uncertain, because it's there that growth happens. When we get into that uncomfortable place where growth happens, we have the opportunity to learn how to do new things. We have an opportunity to discover what we're actually capable of saying, doing, and becoming. We realize in that uncomfortable place where growth happens that we are capable of saying, doing, and becoming so much more than we are right now. But here's an interesting observation about habits. You and I often form habits without intending to do so. In fact, all of us learned habits from our parents in the early formative years of our lives. We also learned habits from our classmates and our teachers in school. We later learned them from our employers, as well as our friends, our family, and our neighbors, and our coworkers all throughout life. So many of the habits that you and I have ingrained may not even be those of our own making, but we've embraced those as our own and accepted them as truth. And that in itself can become a self-imposed prison. You know, motivational speaker Les Brown says it well. He says we become the sum total of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Their habits, their mannerisms, and their beliefs become our own. And if we spend time with unsuccessful people, guess what happens? We pick up and we ingrain in our thinking and in our behaviors unsuccessful habits that begin to manifest themselves in our lives. If you spend time with turkeys, you're going to become a turkey. And if you want to soar with eagles, you can't hang out with the turkeys. But when we hang out with unsuccessful people and we adapt and embrace unsuccessful habits, what are we doing? We're building an aquarium of our own making, limiting just how far we can go in life. Now, Samuel Smiles was a 19th century self-help author. I love this quote from one of his books. Sow a thought and you reap an act. Sow an act and you reap a habit. Sow a habit and you reap a character. Sow a character and you reap a destiny. Author Sean Covey echoed Samuel Smiles' comments when he said, we become what we repeatedly do. Now, think about what those two authors said. Our habits define who we are and what we do. So we must choose our habits well. Now, let me leave you with a third thought. If our habits are formed through repetition, you and I, we can form new habits or eliminate old habits through the same intentional process. You and I get an opportunity every day to choose the same choices or to make different choices. We choose whether to accept the status quo or to challenge the status quo every single day of our lives. And when we choose, as Carly Fiorina says, to challenge the status quo, to change things for the better, we begin the process of reshaping who we are and what we do by replacing habits that aren't serving us well with other habits that do. Now, this process of habit reformation or creating new habits is a slow, meticulous process, but it can be done. Let me give you an example. In 2018, 55 million Americans that were smokers quit smoking. That's almost 62% of all the smokers in the United States quit smoking in 2018. It was a significant year, but what happened? It required that these 55 million individuals replace a habitual pattern of behavior that wasn't serving them well with another habitual pattern of behavior that would. It meant venturing into the uncomfortable. It meant walking into the unfamiliar, and it meant facing the uncertain to find another way. It was a slow, meticulous process. Some days they won, some days they took a step backwards, but every day they learned and they continued to move forward until they succeeded. They understood what Og Mandino wrote in his classic book, I Will Persist Until I Succeed. Now, these 55 million Americans, they quit smoking. Guess what? That same pattern of intentional, focused reformation of habits, you can do the very same thing. When it comes to habit modification, behavior modification, or habit formation, call it what you want, real life management teaches the ALTER methodology. ALTER. Let me break that down for you very quickly as we move to wrap up today's podcast. The A is acknowledging your goal. The question you want to ask is this: what is your desired outcome? So after you acknowledge your goal and you ask the question, what is your desired outcome? The L is learning new information. Essentially, the question is, what is required to bring about my desired outcome? The T is tactical planning. Once I understand what my outcome is and what is required, what are the steps to get me from where I am to where I want to be? The E is execution. It's walking the walk and not just talking the talk. It's implementing the tactical plan and seeing that you follow the process through to its completion. The R is reflection. Taking a time to revisit what you're doing and analyze if it's working, if it needs to be tweaked or adjusted, asking the question, how am I doing? Can I do better in any way? And then once you alter that particular habit and that becomes ingrained, you then ask the question, what's next? And you go back through the ALTER methodology once again. Now, personally, I like this approach, and I teach it often when I'm out working with individuals and organizations. And why do I like it? It's an incremental approach to help you reprogram your thinking. Now, why is this important? Remember, as you think, you become. And once you stop thinking and habit kicks in, you stop becoming. So if your thoughts shape your belief and your belief shapes your choices, when you alter your thinking, guess what happens? You alter your beliefs, you alter your choices, and you ultimately alter your destiny, your outcomes. So let me leave you now with a closing thought. In traditional martial arts, there are 10 degrees of black belt. And in between first Dan and 10th Dan, there are years of training between each promotional rank. In traditional martial arts, from first Dan to second Dan, once you get your first degree black belt, it's a 2-year minimum training process before you're eligible to test for second Dan, second degree black belt. From second to third, it's a 3-year training process. From third to fourth is 4 years, and so on. So from first Dan to 10th Dan, at a minimum, it's 54 years of training. Now, I want you to think about that in the process of becoming a black belt expert, a world-class master of who you are and what you do. If it takes a minimum of 54 years to get to 10th Dan in the martial arts, and you want to become a black belt master of who you are and what you do, you're in for a lifetime of learning. Now, let me also point out that at any time along the way, a black belt can say, I'm done. And that individual advances no further. They can get to third or fourth and say, I quit. I'm done. That's as far as I want to go. And at that point, what's happened? That black belt has built an aquarium of his or her own making. They've limited their ability to learn, to grow, to mature, and to become a better version of themselves. And they've also limited their influence and the opportunity to make an even greater impact in the lives of other people. Now, remember, you're tuning into this podcast because you want to become a black belt leader in life, and you want to live your life with black belt excellence. So hear me as I say this as we wrap up today's training. As a black belt leader in life, you and I, we have the same opportunity as those black belt instructors. You get to choose whether you're going to stop at second or third degree black belt, or you're going to keep going till you get to 10th Dan. And even at your 10th degree Grand Master black belt, there's still more to learn and the obligation to replicate what you've learned in the lives of others. So you've got the same opportunity and you've got the same choice. You can choose to settle for the comfortable, the familiar, and you can choose to stay where you are, as you are, in the commonplace conundrum, or you can choose a different path. One choice is going to imprison you in an aquarium of your own making. The other choice is going to free you to explore the endless oceans of opportunity and truly become a world-class master of who you are and what you do as you live your life with black belt excellence. Here's what I'm here to tell you. Black belt leaders in life choose to explore the endless oceans of opportunity by learning, growing, maturing, and becoming a better version of themselves every single day. I hope you will choose the latter. I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Thanks for joining me, and have a great day.